Oh, please don't stop talking on my behalf. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad. For those who know me, I am Valéria Piccoli. I am the Ken and Linda Cutler Chair of the Arts of the Americas Department and the Curator of Latin American Art at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So thank you so much for being here. I know what kind of commitment we need to choose to be inside an auditorium in a glorious sunny Sunday. So thank you so much for being here. I'm glad to see a full house. We are here today to celebrate one of the most prominent Mexican artists, José María Velasco, El Maestro Velasco, how he is known in his home country. From the 1860s until his death in 1912, Velasco was a major figure in the context of the Mexican Academy of Fine Arts, creating landscape paintings intended to disseminate internationally an image of Mexico that would speak simultaneously, this is a mouthful for a Brazilian, I'm sorry, to its ancient past, the mestizo character of its culture and its path to modernity. We have the extraordinary opportunity of having here at MIA artworks that rarely leave Mexico, together with paintings coming from the National Museum of the Czech Republic that seldom leave the storage of the museum. So this is a unique chance, really, for all of us, the visitors of MIA, to experience these paintings here. The exhibition was organized in collaboration with the National Gallery London, where it was presented from March to August 2025. And today I have the pleasure of having here with me the two colleagues who I have been working with for the last year and a half to bring this exhibition to fruition. And I will ask them to come to the stage. First, Dexter Dalwood, who is a British artist based in Mexico City. In 2017, he undertook a residency in Oaxaca, where he created the work An Inadequate Painted History of Mexico, shown in the Esto No Me Pertenece exhibition at the Centro de las Artes San Agustín and at MUNAL during 2021 and 2022. His major solo museum shows include Kunsthaus Centre PasquArt, CAC Málaga, FRAC Champagne-Ardennes, and Tate St. Ives. Recent group exhibitions include the Paradoxes of Internationalism at Museo Tamayo, You to Me, Me to You at A4 Arts Foundation, Modern Media Networks at Tate Modern, Hello World at Hamburger Bahnhof, and Michael Jackson on the Wall at the National Portrait Gallery and other venues. His first solo show opened in September 2024 at Lisson Gallery in London. Please, Dexter, come on. Daniel Sobrino Ralston is the CEH, or Centro de Estudios de la Europa Hispánica, Associate Curator of Spanish Paintings at the National Gallery London. He's lectured and published widely on Spanish art from the 17th to the 19th centuries, contributing to recent exhibition catalogs for instance, at the Fundación Mafre, Raimundo de Madrazo, the Galleria d'Italia, Velázquez, Un Segno Grandioso, the National Gallery After Impressionism, Inventing Modern Art, and the Kimber Art Museum, Murillo from Heaven to Earth. He studied art history at the University of Birmingham. University. Daniel, please. So the way we will be that each of us will speak for more or less 10 to 15 minutes about different aspects of Velasco's career and artistic career. And then we can open the conversation to questions coming from the audience. So thank you.
Giving just a little bit of a brief introduction and also really how this exhibition came about. As Valéria said, I first came to Mexico, I first went to Mexico in 2017, and out of being in Mexico, I started to make a series of paintings based on Mexican history, which ended up, I mean, a pandemic came in between, but ended up being an exhibition which was curated by a young Oaxacan curator in MUNAL, which opened in September 2021. So the exhibition is called Esto No Me Pertenece, which means this doesn't belong to me. So it was this idea of somebody making paintings about Mexican history that wasn't Mexican, was looking at it in a way that my work has always been concerned with the idea of making a kind of new version of history painting, so a version of contemporary history painting. So this is the building which actually houses the majority of Velasco's works in Mexico City. The National Museum of Art, which was also known as MUNAL. So this is one of the main, this is like the Velasco room, where I first saw these grand, two large paintings you can see either side of the Met painting. The large painting is the final painting in the show upstairs, the 1877 Valle de Mexico, and the one on the right, 1875. But what was so interesting for me when I visited MUNAL, and that we began to have a discussion of the exhibition that I would do there, is the director asked me if I would like to include works from the collection within the exhibition that I was making, so to show other Mexican art next to the works that I was doing, which involved and allowed me into the kind of crazy bowels of the storage space in MUNAL to see what was actually kept off the walls. And what was very interesting for me very quickly was the artist who was being presented in the gallery was a much, much more interesting artist when I actually saw the huge variety and scope of his work. And I think also it's very important to underline that this exhibition here, and the exhibition which started at the National Gallery, is that the whole focus of the exhibition and the focus on Velasco was solely as a landscape painter, because I think that when I had the idea that I thought it was, I couldn't quite understand why Velasco hadn't been shown in Europe or the UK for over 50 years. There hadn't been a show, a major Velasco show since 1976 in Antonio in Texas, so San Antonio in Texas. So it was this idea of, I couldn't understand why a European audience hadn't seen it. So eventually, after seeing these two paintings which were in the storage, the painting previously, but also to think about specifically his relationship to late 19th century landscape painting generally. And I think the other point was, that was very clear to me, and I'm sure a lot of people also here, because I myself, and I always thought out, even when I first mentioned his name to the director of the National Gallery, hadn't actually heard of him. So there was this idea also that within the history of Mexican painting, everybody seemed to know about the muralists. They knew about Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, José Clemente Orozco, and David Sequeires. But if you ask somebody, well, name me a 19th century Mexican painter, there was a bit of a blank. So it was this desire to think about how a show could be constructed for the National, particularly a bespoke exhibition for the National Gallery, thinking about the relationship that he had to art, his contemporaries, particularly if you think of Paul Cézanne, who's almost identical dates to Velasco, born in 1840, Velasco dies in 1912. So it was this thing of thinking across and how that could possibly be. But meanwhile, I was thinking, I mean, I found these two small paintings which in the storage, which hadn't been on the walls of MUNAL for years. I was very keen to include them in the exhibition that I made. So I just quickly show the titles of the two paintings are The Pyramid of the Sun, de Teotihuacan, and Aztec Vase, and the Goatherd of San Angel. So the two paintings which were then put in this installation that I made. So the painting in the middle is a painting of mine called 1910, because I also became fascinated with Mexicans' very close relationship to history and dates. It's almost that almost any Mexican can give you a list of 4 dates, just reel them straight off. 1520, when the Spanish arrived and the fall of the Aztecs, the Mexica. 1810, when the break from the church in Rome. 1857, the Constitution, and then most famously 1910, the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. So this is just one of the rooms in MUNAL. I'm not going to show you the whole exhibition. And then also, from doing that, I included other artists as well as Velasco, but I'm just showing a couple of smaller paintings. This was a very little painting on a huge great white wall, because it was a painting based on the Execution of Maximilian by Edward Manet, the famous 1867 painting, which he made 3 versions of, and one is in the National Gallery in London also. But for me, it was this point where this gunshot, really, which was the end of really the last point in time when Mexico was ever colonized. After that gunshot, it never happened again. So it's this point within Mexican history, just how significant that was. And then included, see on the left-hand side, is Diego Rivera's 1915 painting, Zapatista Landscape, when he was still in Paris. So he was in Paris throughout the whole of the Mexican Revolution, but making these Cubist paintings. And I think it's one of the best Cubist paintings ever made, actually, which is also included in MUNAL's collection. On the right there is a small Jose Clemente Orozco. This is my huge, expanded wall drawing from a detail of one of the codexes, which is this illustration of the colonization by the Spanish. And that's another painting of the final room. But that small painting to the far left is by Francisco Goyeta. And I think the other thing to mention is Francisco Goyeta, Diego Rivera were both students of Velasco. So they studied under him in the San Carlos Academy. And Francisco Goyeta is the only Mexican artist who actually fought in the Mexican Revolution, who actually witnessed, he was actually involved with Pancho Villa, and it was in several battles. He actually wanted to be the artist kind of with the army, and Pancho Villa said to him, I don't want you to paint, I want you to see the splattered blood on the uniforms of your enemy. So that's the Rivera's Zapatista Landscape. This is my painting, 1519. And that's the Francisco Goyeta and the Jose Clemente Orozco painting. So basically, in the summer of 2022, I went to London, and because I used to be the artist trustee at the National Gallery for 9 years, I met with the director, Gabriele Finaldi, and pitched him an idea for an exhibition to show José María Velasco in the National Gallery. And he, halfway through the pitch, I was worried when he hadn't heard of him to start with, I saw a kind of light go on behind his eyes, that this could be a very interesting show for the National Gallery, also because the National Gallery had never previously done an exhibition of a Latin American artist. So very quickly, once the proposal was, I'd written an initial proposal, I was gifted Daniel to work on the project with me. So very quickly we started to work together in tandem with everything, working up the proposal into a proper established exhibition, working up a wish list of the loans that we would finally secure. And it meant that Daniel had to come to Mexico also. So this is one of our first field trips to Orizaba in Veracruz, where we went to this extraordinary museum to find the following painting, which is upstairs, the Cometa of the Grand Cometa of 1882, which was quite an extraordinary thing to see, because we'd only seen things in reproduction, and to see it in the flesh at the end of this long corridor was actually quite a moving moment. And the other thing, like all these things, with when you find a painting that you want, immediately you think, if we don't get it, the exhibition isn't going to be the same as we hoped for. So it was a long process to secure this loan. So we were very, very indebted to them finally giving to us. You see Daniel's here doing a little check of a condition check of the painting by shining his iPhone torch onto the surface. And then finally, when later on, 2024, Gabriel Finardi, the director of the National Gallery, came to Mexico with Daniel and also for the first time actually saw many of the works at MUNAL and began to think about how we were going to get the desired works which weren't in the museum. So we did several trips to private collectors' houses, etc. So very, very happily, as we say, finally this exhibition opened in March of this year. And I think for me also, just to say why I think personally this was so important to me, was because I think as an artist as well, is that sometimes you feel a connection with other artists, and also you feel that why have they somehow dropped out of the canon? If you like, why are they not better known? And I think the strange thing about Velasco's paintings is that he had this ability to direct the viewer and make the viewer think about what you were looking at when you actually examined especially one of the large landscape paintings, to make you consider the idea of history, the idea of the present, the contemporary moment, but also this idea how the landscape itself is in a continual flux of disappearance and renewal. That things are fading away, things are being removed, and then new things are coming in. So there's an extraordinary idea that he's painting what he sees, but he's also painting the past. So there's this idea that industrialization is coming to the Valley of Mexico, and as you can see from the paintings upstairs, you'll see paintings of the factories, train lines coming in, and it's not that he's painting a kind of romanticized version of the landscape. It's very much a kind of new Mexican realism, and I can't emphasize enough the difference that made within Mexican painting. Because up to that point also there were a lot of European artists who came to Mexico, kind of journeyman artists making landscape paintings, but nothing had the kind of rigor and the detail, but also the thinking eye behind them, the way I think that Velasco is. I think that the way that he can actually transform this moment into something which you really have to think about and negotiate as your eye travels across the surface of the painting. And I think that, again, also, he's dealing with history, and he's dealing with, even in the Valley of Mexico, you know, that when you think about the Aztecs, now we like to call them Mexica, that their whole civilization was less than 160 years. And previously to that, the pyramids of Teotihuacan, when they arrived in the Valley of Mexico, the Mexica didn't actually know what they were. They'd been abandoned for over 200 years when they came. So it was this idea that they made up myths about the pyramids because they didn't actually know. And then it's this very particular thing that Velasco kind of is talking about the past. He's talking about what he sees as the contemporary, but also, in a way, he's suggesting what is the future going to be. And if you go up to the position where that large painting is made, the 1877 painting in Santa Isabel, and you look out across the same view, which I've scrambled up there, it really is now the contemporary view of Mexico City is this extraordinary carpet of concrete which goes across the whole valley, which is now the version of Mexico City today, and what used to be this incredible lake in the middle when the Spanish arrived and first saw it as they came over the volcanoes. So I think I've probably talked for long enough. I'm going to pass on to Daniel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you guys for all being here today. Dexter has told us a lot about sort of the genesis of the show and some of Velasco's particular qualities as an artist. And what I want to do is to pull out a little bit of the reasoning behind Velasco, despite his enormous reputation in Mexico, not having been connected with things outside Mexico for quite some time. Yeah. And being this sort of great national painter didn't necessarily mean that he was well known internationally. And because of that, he's often been thought about in isolation. He's been thought about only in a Mexican context. And I think one of the contentions of the exhibition is that we really ought to think much more about Velasco in particular in a broader sort of international sense. Because obviously in the 19th century, Mexico is interconnected with countries all around the world, and especially the United States and Europe. And indeed, Velasco's particular style, he does have a kind of odd sort of objectivism to his painting that becomes his own really in the 1870s. But when he starts off, and that's the comparison I'm showing you here, he starts off really emulating this Italian painter, Eugenio Landesio. Landesio is born just outside Turin, and he's brought over to be the first ever teacher of landscape painting at the Academy of San Carlos in Mexico City in 1855. Velasco only enters the academy in 1858, so immediately he's sort of plunged into the teaching of Landesio. Landesio is an interesting artist. He's not so well known outside Mexico either, but he has a whole career in Rome, working in sort of a classicizing landscape style. So a work like this from 1839 is sort of this romantic landscape, a view outside the hills of Rome. And he usually peoples his paintings with sort of incidental little human figures. And so you see people here gathering wood on the riverbank. You'll notice that this painting is actually in the collection of the Museo de San Carlos. And it actually had got there before Landesio even became a teacher in the academy. His paintings were bought and brought over to Mexico in the 1850s as sort of examples of landscape painting. Because up until that point, there hadn't really been sort of a landscape idiom or tradition in Mexican painting. And so Landesio is then, on the strength of his paintings, brought over in 1855 to begin teaching. And Landesio is the leading master of landscape painting. And Velasco swiftly becomes his most important and most adept pupil. And you can see the work there on the right, 1862, painted when Velasco was just 22 years old, is clearly indebted to this work, the Apennines and Sub-Apennines, which was already in the collection of San Carlos. Landesio's teaching really involves the close study of nature, the direct observation from the motif. And Velasco follows that throughout his career, and some of his scientific rigor that Dexter was mentioning really has to do in some ways with the way that Landesio trained him in the 1850s and into the 1860s. He really adopts what becomes his really distinctive, mature style, this very spare and austere vision of the Valley of Mexico, especially in these large, large exhibition canvases in about the mid-1870s. And in these works, there's a reason, I think, for that shift. One is that Landesio, who has been in Mexico for about 15 years, retires, and he goes back to Europe. And so Velasco adopts his position at the Academy and begins to have sort of a soapbox to have his particular style of landscape painting more seen. It's also during this period that he begins to send his paintings abroad. The 1875 picture, the first in the exhibition, the big one that you'll see when you walk in, was painted to be sent to Philadelphia in 1876. And it was quite a sensation, quite successful. It receives an award. And Velasco, I think, from that point on, realizes that he can and should, indeed, represent sort of the landscape of Mexico and the nation of Mexico to international audiences. And so it's no coincidence that when he paints this work, just 2 years later, he takes the same vantage point as he had in the 1875 picture, but he strips away all kinds of little incidental details. You remember those two figures in the Landesio picture. In the 1875 painting you'll see upstairs, there are still a couple of figures, staffage figures, that help you sort of enter the landscape as a viewer. But by 1877, Velasco has developed what becomes the style he'll have for the rest of his career, which is this very, very sort of sober and severe vision. There are no figures, there are no people to make this a friendly or sort of inviting landscape. He's instead giving you this very, very profound sort of history lesson. In the far background, very, very far, the modern city. In the middle ground, you can just see those two hills In the very middle, there's sort of a little settlement at the bottom, and that's where the Basilica of Guadalupe is, then as now. And that is the site of the most important sort of cult figure in Mexican Catholicism, the Virgin of Guadalupe. And according to the story, this Nahua peasant, Juan Diego, encounters the Virgin. He's been recently converted to Catholicism. He encounters her, and then on that site, she blesses his tilma, his cloak, with her image. So it's an image that is miraculous, created by the hand of God, and that is still the image that's venerated in that basilica. And so that Velasco includes that right at the center, tells you already, you don't know this unless you know the story, but once you do, you begin to see that it is a painting of history, not just landscape, as Dexter was pointing out. Many of his works sort of have that historical quality to them. And then, of course, in the foreground, you have the nopal, the prickly pear cactus, and an eagle flying away from it. And of course, if you think of what's in the center of the flag of Mexico, a prickly pear cactus with an eagle perched on it with a snake in its beak. And that refers back to the founding of Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City. And that is the founding of the Aztec, the Mexica Empire, and the thing that has remained sort of a constant in Mexican identity since the 16th century, the story of the founding of Tenochtitlan, which was one of these sort of wonders of the world when Cortés encounters it. It's a city built on water, surrounded by lakes. And Velasco, in these big paintings, wants to give you a sense of all of that. This work he paints to send to Paris. He paints it expressly to be sent to the Exposition Universelle of 1878. Of course, it's a bit of a problem. The problem is that Mexico is a bit of a pariah in Europe at this point, because that one rifle shot that Dexter depicts in his own painting had only echoed out in 1867. So the crowned heads of Europe were not well pleased with the Mexicans for bumping off an Austrian archduke, even if a minor one, but still somewhat important. And so this relationship between European countries and Europe in the 1870s was not especially warm. And so there's no Mexican pavilion at the Exposition in 1878. So Velasco actually shows this work. He sends it at his own expense to the Spanish pavilion at the exposition. And we had very, very little known about how his work was received until some of the research that we did for this exhibition, where we discovered this reference, a French critic with this amazing name, Léonce Dubosc de Pesquidou. And he says, I mean, exactly as you'd want a person like that to say, that this work by Velasco is sort of quite barren and desolate compared to the glittering works of a Spanish painter like Martin Rico. And I give you an example up there of a work from about the same period. Rico, a very interesting artist in his own right, but is a very sort of dainty and dazzling painter, very much the fashionable kind of painter of the 1870s. And so you can imagine that in Europe in this period, what Velasco's work would have looked like would have been quite hard to understand. You don't know the sort of the history of the site that is being depicted, or why Velasco has chosen to include sort of the elements in the foreground. So I think you get a sense that early on, it's not clear to many people what exactly they should make of Velasco when he's shown internationally. But Velasco is not just international in the sense that he sends his works abroad. He's also international in his clientele, which is maybe not what you would have expected, but the circle around Maximilian, with whom Velasco is somewhat associated in the 1860s, includes, as you'd expect, a lot of Austrians and Czechs that have been brought over as sort of part of the army, or part of, in the case of the man on the screen, the medical corps. This is František Kaska, later Baron Kaska, who comes to Mexico in the 1860s with Maximilian and his troops as a pharmacist. So he's there as part of sort of the medical staff of Maximilian. After Maximilian gets bumped off in 1867, Kaska sticks around, interestingly. We don't know much about his early years following the death of Maximilian, but he begins to establish, by the mid-1870s, a relatively successful pharmaceutical business. And he becomes, surprisingly, Velasco's most important collector. There's also a circle of people around him, including another Austrian doctor, Federico Semmeleder, as well as some German bankers that are mentioned in some of Velasco's account papers, that acquire works by the painter. So it's interesting, Velasco's works were very appealing to people who were trying to understand Mexico and trying to integrate themselves into its culture. And Casca is not only sort of a conduit for Velasco's paintings to buyers, he's also a conduit for this connection to Europe. So Valéria mentioned in her introduction that, again, perhaps surprisingly and mysteriously, there are 3 paintings in this exhibition of a Mexican painter that are coming from Prague. The reason being that Casca, with his great collection of Velasco, lives out the rest of his life in Mexico City. He dies in 1907 and has been sort of in contact with members of the Austro-Hungarian imperial family. He's sort of this unofficial diplomat in a way. And part of that connection leads him to bequeath his entire collection of works, as well as sort of ethnographic memorabilia that has to do with the time of Maximilian in Mexico, to the museum that becomes the National Museum of the Czech Republic. Something like 1,250 objects arrive in crates in Prague in 1908. I think, understandably, the officials of the museum are somewhat bemused by all of these things. There's sort of Maximilian's standards, a couple of old uniforms, as well as some paintings of no real interest. You know, they show Mexico as far as they know. And they're cataloged as Mexican painting. And they go then, of course, as these things often do, into the storage. And it's only some 60 years later, when a Czech art historian is going through some of these things in preparation for an exhibition, that he realizes that not only these are not just Mexican paintings, these are paintings of real quality by one of the great 19th century Mexican painters, José María Velasco. And the works, because they're not essential to sort of telling the history of the Czech Republic, are not often on view. So it's a great opportunity to see them here in the exhibition, to get a sense of Velasco's international reach. But this connection, I mentioned the Austro-Hungarian royal family, is especially interesting because, of course, in 1867, diplomatic relations cease between Mexico and Austria-Hungary. Casca seems to act as a sort of back-channel connection between the two countries. So much so that when diplomatic relations are resumed in 1901, it seems to be on the back of some negotiating that he has done. Because what happens in that year is a memorial chapel is opened to the memory of Maximilian on the Cerro de las Campanas, the Hill of the Bells, the place where he was executed. And in this image, taken by Guillermo Kahlo, the father of Frida Kahlo, who was a photographer, you see a couple notable figures. On the far left, the bald, bearded baron, and then I think the number 3, big white beard standing in the back, third from the left, is Velasco. And seated with his legs crossed is the Austro-Hungarian prince who has been there as the leader of the delegation, Karl Khevenhuller. And at this occasion, not only sort of is this relationship between nations resumed, but Velasco hosts a dinner for the visiting dignitaries in his house, and then he also gives them a painting. And he makes, this painting here on the left is a copy that he makes for himself of this work, which shows the newly built memorial chapel on the Hill of the Bells. The original work was given to the Khevenhuller family on this trip, and despite our best efforts, we've been in touch with their descendants. We were not able to find the original version, which must be knocking around in some Schloss in Austria. We hope, unless it's been lost. But this version, I think, gives you a sense already of what Velasco was doing, which is to connect, sort of in an unexpected way, this much bigger international history to a particular place. And it's exactly the same place that is represented by Manet in the 1860s. Manet, of course, never comes to Mexico. He paints this all from press reports. But I think, especially in the National Gallery where this picture hangs, it was an interesting way for us to think about the much broader implications for Velasco's work across the Atlantic in the 19th century, and to think about these connections. So Velasco is really, and ought to be considered, a really international artist. And Dexter included this work in his exhibition at MUNAL. And it's really an extraordinary thing for the way that it gives a sense of Velasco's legacy and impact internationally. So you can see in the far background, just there, Popocatépetl, which is one of the main volcanoes of the Valley of Mexico, which appears in many of the paintings that you can see upstairs. This is a work that he makes in Paris, but certainly looking at that landscape, he's thinking about the lessons of Velasco. He also brings in, of course, a cubist kind of motif, and then down in the bottom right, he borrows something from Zurbarán or Velázquez, which is this unsigned cardellino. So rather than sign your name, Velázquez was very well known for having empty cardellinos, as if to sort of show his patrons that, well, if you have to ask who it's by, I mean, then you ought to know it's by me. And I think what Rivera is doing is bringing together all these different traditions. And so you can see how Velasco participates both as teacher and artist in these broader sort of international currents that throughout the 19th century and early 20th century bring Europe and Mexico and Europe and the United States closer together. And with that, I think I'll hand over to Valéria.
And I think that my 2 cents that I'll bring to this conversation will really be to kind of expand a little more our understanding of Velasco in a kind of a hemispheric perspective. So so what I brought here for you today, it's like some examples of artists that are painting or that have dedicated themselves to landscape painting across the Americas at the same time as Velasco. So we can have a sense of how Velasco is part of a broader, I wouldn't say movement, but a broader approach to landscape painting that was happening at the same time in different countries in the Americas. I'm not saying that it's all the same thing, because of course each painter is working from their own place, and their practice is of course is kind of contaminated by the local histories, the local perspectives, and the local artistic scenarios that the artist is embedded in, and as much as Velasco, those paintings will be kind of imbued with the sense of national identity all across the Americas. So oh no, I'm doing it wrong. It's here. Okay, I don't need to tell you about what this painting means, right? And we are looking here at a painting by Bierstadt in 1865, which is like the period that Velasco is still a student at the Mexican Academy, and Bierstadt, as well as Thomas Moran, that we have here in the next slide, are painters that are part of scientific expeditions to the West, and kind of discovering this majestic nature of the West, and transforming them into images that will speak to the American spirit, let's say. And also become a part of this imaginary about the manifest destiny and the necessity of expansion to the West. And they are kind of examples of this scientific impulse and economic imperatives that drove the westward expansion of the United States. This image of the majestic West, of course, became natural icons for the American imagination. But we cannot lose sight that this, for instance, this place that Bierstadt is painting here in 1865 was only 20 years prior to that, was part of Mexico, right? This was Mexican territory just 20 years before that. And we can also not lose sight of the fact that he's painting these landscapes as they were absolutely void of people, which is also not true. So in this case, in the American in the American imagination, this idea of the free and available land to the West becomes part of also of this imagination about that. That collaborate to this idea of manifest destiny. And we have other examples, for instance, in the Quebec region of Canada, this idea that landscape painting is also conveying these struggles against nature and how to dominate nature and how to extract resources from nature, and all emphasizing the presence of the rivers that were so essential to the conqueror, to the conqueror of the territory in Canada, but also everything tinted with this kind of autumn foliage that becomes that really joins to our imagination of Canada, what Canada is today, until today. Other examples that we can bring to the table are, for instance, the Argentinian painter Prilidiano Pueyrredón, who in the 1860s is trying to create an image of the Argentinian pampas, which presented a particular kind of challenge for a painter because there is no topography in the pampas, it's just flat land. So how do you depict this kind of landscape that don't have a special topography? The proposition or the proposal of Pueyrredón was really to transform the pampa in this kind of stage where the countryman would perform their daily activities in dealing with horses and cattle and all these productive agricultural activities that would take in place. But as much as Bierstadt, this is not true, because in 1861, the Pampa was still indigenous territory. So, and some 10 years later, the government of Argentina would promote a campaign, which was the campaign of the desert, what they called, because the Pampa for them was a desert. And it was really a campaign to exterminate the indigenous peoples of the Pampas and really appropriate this land and transform this into agricultural land. So all of this kind of imagination are imaginations. They are not. They don't correspond to what, as much as they were true to the topography or the natural characteristics of that place. They are not depicting the truth, right? This is what I wanted to reinforce. The same thing for Rafael Troya in Ecuador, for instance, an artist that was actually trained in landscape painting by scientists. So there were no landscape painters in Ecuador at the time, and he was engaged as a young artist in scientific expeditions. So there were like geologists and botanists that actually showed them treatises of painting and taught them and taught Troya how to paint. And his compositions, as you can see, have this kind of idealized feeling. Are very, in a way, very European, although he is here depicting like the specific, the part of Ecuador that is more easily recognized as a traditional landscape with the presence of the volcanoes. So Ecuador is the part of South America that have the most active volcanoes and this is the Cotopaxi. It's the largest one of them, and it's also like one of the subjects that Frederick Church dedicated himself to when he traveled to South America. And to finish this kind of overview, a quick overview of what would be like artists that were painting at the same time as Velasco in other parts of the Americas. I would call attention to Pedro Américo, who is a Brazilian artist, also like as much as Velasco, a product of the Academy of Fine Arts in Brazil. And I think that is curious to see that because they come, both Velasco and Pedro Américo come from this kind of academic environment, their landscape painting is very, their landscape paintings have a large component of history painting. And here Pedro Américo is actually depicting like the final scene, the final, what precedes the final battle of the war of the Triple Alliance in South America, which gathered Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay against poor Paraguay. That was a massacre. But what's interesting here is how much Pedro Américo gives the way to, or gives space for the depiction of nature here. And he is depicting like this kind of frontier between Brazil and Paraguay where the battle will take place. And this is represented by the Chaco, or the marshes that represent Paraguay, the territory of Paraguay, and on the other side, the forest, the dense forest that is associated with Brazil. I think that until today, right? So nature and landscape really become like a symbolic representation of the battle that is about to begin in this painting. And I just wanted to make like this parallel between Velasco and Pedro Américo because of this really important component of history painting that they bring to their practice of landscape. And I think that is everything that we had to talk. I would just come back so we have Velasco at our back here. Yeah, no, this one. And we can open the conversation to your questions. And just remember that there will be like 2 microphones in the audience. And because we are recording this, it will be important for you to speak on the microphone so everybody can hear you. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. Question, as far as with the sort of historical painting context here of Velasco and some of the different America's painters, I'm curious how it ties in or doesn't tie into a little bit more of the sort of European romantic style painting that happened maybe about a century prior, if that was part of the influence or not of this artist.
Would you like me to shout it out? Yes, I quite agree. So I think Landesio, so his teacher and his formative influence for much of his early career, is someone who you'd really identify as sort of painting landscapes in a romantic tradition. So that kind of romantic landscape painting you can think of really from about the year 1800 up until 1830, 40. Landscape, though, is intriguing as a genre, because Valéria was talking about how history painting sort of begins to infect it in a certain way. And that's a very sort of particular moment in the history of landscape painting. Around 1800, the French Academy establishes a prize for paysage historique, so historical landscape. So it's a way of elevating landscape as a genre, because up until this point, landscape painting is not considered very prestigious. And so by putting in sort of elements of history, you can tell a bigger story about it. And so Velasco, I think, exactly comes out of that tradition, as you're quite right to say. He is someone who's sort of trained in the workshop of an artist who is an adept painter of this kind of romantic landscape. But what he takes out of it, which Dexter pointed out, is he removes some of that sort of softness of tone, that sort of richness of color, and it becomes much more spare and scientific in a way. And he also trains and works as a scientist throughout his career to an extent. And so I think the way that he brings those things together is what gives his painting its really particular kind of look.
And I was saying in what I was trying to highlight in the images that I showed to you, it's really how each specific context transforms the genre, the model, the European model of landscape painting when it's practiced outside Europe. Of course, the compositions, they follow the same model. You have like the three components, the three elements, the foreground, middle ground, and background. Everything in terms of composition will, of course, be the same, but the elements change according to the social, political, artistic peculiarities of each country. So that's why.
So I'm wondering two related things, and the first is whether other landscape, the artists that you were pointing out and others who are doing landscapes like Cezanne, whether they were even faintly aware of this Latin American artist, or whether there were other experts in the world who were. And then what accounts for the fact that he is such a surprise for so many of us? And Valéria, you mentioned that you're coming across him and going, "Oh, who is this wonderful painter?" Mm-hmm.
I think I can answer the second one perhaps better than the second part of the question. I think the one thing is, as Valéria was saying, but I think to answer the first question a bit as well, is that the idea of landscape painting, the shift in landscape painting is, for example, within British painting, two of the most famous British artists are J.M.W. Turner and Constable, but they weren't in their own lifetime. That's very important to realise. But also what's so interesting about the two artists is that Turner was painting, the beginning of trains, he painted, and also the end of an end of a period of history, like the painting The Fighting Temeraire, the very famous painting of one of Nelson's flagships being dragged into the docks to be broken up, was the idea that this was a period of time which was coming to an end, and steam and rail was going to replace it, whereas Constable was very, very against what was happening to the countryside that he lived in as a child. He could see the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and wanted to keep it as it was, as he remembered as a small boy. So in both attitudes, there's this idea that it's a romanticizing of something. And I think with also a lot of American painting, Birdstyle, for example, there's still a kind of, that America is this kind of untouched Eden. It's a very beautiful kind of romantic place. So there are things which are being invented continually in terms of the agenda, whereas Velasco seems to want to paint really what he sees, exactly, in as much detail and with much scientific precision as possible. But also, he wants you to think about these things which have happened historically. So there's a kind of, it's why I think the work has a kind of toughness to it, which when you encounter it, you feel you're having to really think about what you're looking at and why you're looking at it. So I think and in a sense, you can't underestimate the difference that he made in making this particular kind of Mexican realism, really, which hadn't been seen before. So I think that was the point where there's a departure from the idea of the romantic idea of landscape painting, right from Caspar David Friedrich and all that, suddenly that he shifts something, and then as a consequence, I think it changed everything within Mexico particularly, and also that generation who came after him.
Yeah, but I think there is also a component he died in 1912, right? And you have like this strong generation that comes after him, Diego Rivera, Orozco, Los Tres Grandes, Frida Kahlo, whatever. So, and I think that they a little bit overshadowed his image in a way, internationally, I would say, in the reception of his work internationally. And also because I think that for some time, the 19th century was a little out of fashion, right? People were so interested in this in modern art, in the avant-garde movements of the beginning of the 20th century, that everything that came before it was a little bit like, oh, this looks so European, and I think that there was a little bit of a lack of interest from, and I include, I mean, us art historians, not us specifically because we like old stuff, but there are many. I think that many art historians wouldn't look at these paintings with the same attention as they looked to Diego Rivera and all the other modernist painters.
And then I think also the first part of your question about whether in the 19th century, in his lifetime, sort of critics in Europe were aware of him. And I think in general, no, we can say quite safely, because he really only exhibits works there in major exhibitions on 2 occasions, and there's a couple other isolated ones where he sends a couple works to Madrid, but he's not there in force, and he's there as basically a non-selling artist, right? He's working within these national pavilions for the most part, so his work is not on the market. So for that reason, I think it's hard for him to become known to critics. There are a couple mentions of his work in the 1889 exhibition when he has things in Paris, similarly in Chicago in 1893, but he doesn't seem to sell works while he's there, so there's little opportunity for things to sort of enter into the broader realm. But there is some interesting early American interest in him, because quite oddly at a Falling Water, the Frank Lloyd Wright house, in that collection there's a painting that up until like a year or two ago was long thought to be by Velasco, and apparently purchased in Detroit in the 1930s. It turns out to not be. It's by his student, Adolfo Tenorio. But there is this interest in Velasco already in the 1930s in the US. I think the final thing that contributes to him not being an artist that people know enough about now is that in the 1940s, he dies in 1912, the first major sort of retrospective exhibition about him is held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City. Huge exhibition, maybe 250 things in it. And after that exhibition, as a consequence of it, the government is sort of so taken by his work, which is really supported by Rivera, who is a great champion of his work, that they declare his entire oeuvre, so basically anything he touched, drawing, painting, etching, anything at all, is part of a national historical monument, meaning that none of those works can ever be exported permanently from Mexico. So we're very lucky to have them here, of course, on temporary loan, but it's not possible for work by Velasco that's in Mexico to be sold outside Mexico, so which has limited some of his compass in a way.
I'm struck by he is later than many of the other landscape artists. He could have used the tools. I mean, he's in contrast to the tools of photography, and yet he is doing history and accuracy. When I looked at his bio, I'm struck by him being a surveyor as well, that he was using tools of science to probably create his art. Can you talk about what tools he may have used?
That's a very good question, actually. And I think something perhaps we haven't emphasized enough is just how much of a scientist he was as well, because he was also an extremely well-read geologist and an understanding. And I think what happened also, within Mexico at that period of time is when the Origin of the Species is translated, and the whole concept of the age of the Earth is suddenly, people begin to realize it is actually not 4.5 billion as they know now, but that it was much, much older than anyone imagined. And Paul Cézanne, the same, was absolutely obsessed. Geology in the 1855, 1860s was a kind of a very, very attractive science. There were huge lectures given which were completely sold out, everyone listening to this new information. But to answer more specifically your question, because there are questions about, given the fact that Guillermo Carlo was a photographer, and also we think, although we haven't been able to make direct links with this, helped Velasco within the Anthropological Museum, because also Velasco did make drawings from photographs of various archaeological sites. But I think in this painting, and as I said in my talk to begin with, I've been up there, and there's no way that you can see the city of the cathedral in Mexico City from where you are. So I think there's a very good chance that he used binoculars. He used binoculars to make the painting of the city. And also he was very, very interested in cartography as well. So the whole thing of map making. And it's almost as if the city is laid down like a map in the distance. But that's what's so extraordinary about him, I think, is that he convinces the viewer that what you see is what you actually see. But there's all sorts of shifting things that he does. Often he drops the perspective below the horizon line to bring the things forward. And he's playing with all kind of optical understandings of the picture plane and how to make optical things work in terms of guiding the eye of the viewer around the canvas.
And he does briefly, in his late 20s, have some kind of photography practice. There's only a couple of photographs that survive. They're mostly I think the two that we know are family pictures. But it's essentially, I think, something that he does to try, and for economic reasons, try and make a little money. But nothing really is known so much about that. But certainly some of the later drawings in particular seem very clearly to show the influence of photography. And he would have been aware, of course, of all those developments.
So the name of Cézanne has popped up several times, and I will be touring this exhibition, and we will be using what's in our collection, and we have Le Jas de Buffon. So could you speak to that, please?
Happily. No, it's especially, Dexter's already mentioned, Cézanne's interest in geology is a particular point of intersection with Velasco. There's this really wonderful exhibition at the Princeton University Art Museum done, I think it opened in 2020 and so therefore went unseen, but the catalog is wonderful. And it really draws out the way that Cézanne, for all the reasons that Dexter mentions, was extraordinarily intrigued with the idea that you could really understand a landscape, which was in a way his main subject. You could understand a landscape in a scientific way. And I think what Velasco does is a very similar thing. One of the contributors to our catalog, Omar Olivares, writes very interestingly about the way that in especially the 1875 painting, those big sort of red rocks that you can see in the foreground, he's very intentionally depicting these specific kinds of rocks that are on that part of the mountain. He's very aware of those things, and it has to do, I think, with his scientific interest. And so thinking about the way that these two painters, even though the end products are completely different, they have very sort of disparate aesthetic sensibilities, the way that they use that same knowledge to create different kinds of things is, I think, one of the things that is a useful tool of comparison in looking at the two of them together.
Thank you so much. Actually, I'm from Mexico City, and I'm very glad to see today this exhibition and all the stuff that you folks take the time and the effort to show us. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. But my question is about during your investigations, did you found something that more other artists in Mexico, they have kind of like follow their steps of him? I'm just kind of wondering, because when I was growing up in Mexico, you know, you used to go buy the tortillas and all the different businesses, and they will give you a little calendar with like landscapes. you know, and so that's kind of like remind me of that. So that's kind of curious about to hear if you found any other artists. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question, yeah. And I think also it's very interesting that anyone who grew up in Mexico City has an experience of seeing Velasco paintings reproduced on, even in school exercise books, they used to be on the covers. And the very famous painting of the cactus, I think, as you know, is it's almost like it's something so common. It's a bit like within British art, a Constable painting of the hay wain is like something, when I was a kid, they were on biscuit tins. And there was just, so it becomes such a common thing that you don't actually think of it as art any longer. It becomes just something which is reproduced continually. But I think, to answer your question specifically, I think that really the most obvious artist influenced by Velasco, who also overlaps him in time, is Dr. Atl, the artist who became obsessed with the idea of the aerial view and made extraordinary numbers of paintings of volcanoes, and famously the eruption of the volcano Paracutin. He went there and drew the volcano, but he also was, in a way, an innovator of landscape painting, slightly beyond Velasco, because as you can see in this large Velasco painting, he does enjoy a kind of slightly elevated view down onto something. So Dr. Atl became this artist who went up into aeroplanes and started making paintings and sketches from the air, and thought that actually he wrote a manifesto, this was going to change landscape painting forever, because this was the new vision, the view from above. But I think that's the most direct reference, because I think that what happens with Velasco at the end of his career, he does go very out of fashion. So he eventually he loses his job at San Carlos, because there's a new way of painting, which is there's lots of very sort of mannerist painting going on in the late 1890s, early 1900s, of certain people coming from Spain and bringing in the idea of very realist painting, but with kind of dramatic people dressed up in armour, spilling wine in taverns. So it became his work kind of goes out of fashion, and it's only when really an artist like Diego Rivera, and he taught Diego when he was 12. He started taking drawing classes under Velasco, and that even in the museum in Orizaba we visited, there's Diego doing Velasco paintings. He tries to basically copying them in a way. So I think that there's not a contemporary of his I can think of which is really picking up on what he was kind of understanding. I think it took almost a certain amount of time for people to realize how significant he was, where other artists of that period who became popular really have dropped out of the vision. Do you know what I mean? Because they were making work which happened to be quite, well, in an art world term, you would say quite trendy for a period of time, and then really had no interest in terms of the history of painting. And I think that that's also, to answer your question about Cézanne, is that Velasco does travel to Europe. It's not as if he doesn't see Impressionism. He sees Impressionist painting, but he doesn't go back and think, oh, okay, I'm gonna change my style. He kind of keeps with this very meticulous project, which is, when he begins painting in 1860, right through to the end of his life. And I think that's what's so incredibly rewarding about looking at the different the changes in his work as he goes on. It's like he's just continuing, but making sort of trying to use the same motif over and over again, but he's changing his way of making paintings, making landscape painting, and also, as I said, I think it's very ambitious in what he wants to try and carve out, with making you think about what's underneath the surface, for example, and what's on the surface, and also what visits from the cosmos in terms of like painting things like the comet. So it's a huge scope, really, of vision, which I think that's what although it's realist painting, it has an extraordinary scientific imagination in it, and I think that's what really is the thing which is why his work suddenly feels now kind of important again to think about it in relationship to nature and conservation and everything else.
But he was a teacher at the academy for 40 years, so he had also many students who would imitate his style or at least begin their careers painting like Velasco. Yeah, so, but I mean, I wouldn't know how to mention any of them.
Yeah, I think the one name that comes to mind is Adolfo Tenorio, which is doesn't ring in the hallowed halls of art history, unfortunately. And then other related painter would be like Cleofás Almanza, who's more of an impressionist painter. But there's not, Velasco's interesting in that way. He has a lot of students, but very few people really take up his style in that quite direct way.
Well, thank you for bringing this to Minneapolis. I've been trying to figure out how to ask my question. I don't have a background in art, and I knew nothing about Velasco until I came here the other week and saw there was going to be an exhibit. And so I tried to look online to find out as much as I could about him. And I didn't find a lot, but what I sort of ran across were some criticisms of him. And I didn't think they were really fair, but you know, he came along in the period of the Porfiriato, which was to industrialize Mexico. And of course, you had this explosion of the Mexican Revolution and worldwide focus on it. And I just wondered if some of the criticisms are sort of, I ran across in history the word called presentism. And I'm wondering if that's more what we're looking at in some of the critics of Velasco. That's the best way I can put it.
I guess he does receive some criticism in his own lifetime, but do you mean sort of more recent?
I'm sorry?
He does receive some criticism in his own lifetime, but do you mean sort of more recent critiques of his work, or?
Well, I was just looking on the internet and I just checked and I'm not qualified to really. I'm not qualified to really even know who the critics are, what caliber they were. I'm just throwing it out there.
No, thank you. It's an interesting thing to think about, because Velasco has been, especially in his own lifetime, he did take some criticism early on in his career from this one particular liberal critic, Ignacio Manuel Altamirano, who says essentially that he's sort of too closely related to painters who had worked around sort of the circle of Maximilian, so he's politically suspect. That doesn't seem to animate too much debate after a certain point. But I think Velasco's work was really, and it continues to be received as sort of an image of 19th century Mexico. And in terms of other kinds of criticism that have been associated with him, one is that, as you say, the Porfiriato, he's a painter whose work is purchased by Porfirio Diaz, who's the de facto dictator of Mexico for sort of 30 years. But I don't think Velasco, and certainly the work, I don't think, calls out for that kind of political valence. It's, as Dexter said, his own sort of intellectual project that I think sort of outlives him and makes the work still of interest to us today.
And I would say that as much as we respect other people's ideas and criticisms, I mean, the critics are free to criticize. I think that good art is good art, no matter where they come from or when they were made, right? And I think that Velasco is an exceptional painter. I mean, he really knows what he's doing when he's painting. I think that we have maybe space for a last question, because we are, yeah.
Speaking about the Porfiriato, I was thinking about it since he lived during that period of time. was he financed? Who was he financed from? Like, is he doing it with his own money? Was Porfirio Diaz interested in his work? Yeah, this is just a question I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a great question. So Velasco, I mean, generally works on commission, and he works for his major salary comes from working at the Academy of Fine Arts. So he's not receiving sort of money directly from Porfirio Diaz. We do know that Porfirio Diaz bought a number of works by Velasco, whether for the state or for his own private collection. But we don't know anything more, really, about Velasco's relationship with the government. He works as the person who's sent as the head of the Fine Arts delegation to Paris in 1889. When he sends a bunch of works, he goes there as well. So that's in some ways sort of a position that he takes up in sort of officialdom. But other than that, there's really not much to associate the government of the Porfiriato and Velasco, which is surprising in a way, because he becomes sort of this great person who creates the image of 19th century Mexico. But in terms of actual documentation, there's very little to suggest even what Velasco's political leanings were. We know he's a devout Catholic. We imagine he might sort of lean toward a more sort of conservative part of the political spectrum under the Porfiriato, but we don't really know that much. And I don't think from the works themselves you can really pull out that kind of message, I would say.
And with that, I think we end the event for today. Thank you very much for being here with us. I do hope you enjoy the exhibition. I do hope you spread the word, and let's make Velasco be seen for as many people as we can. Also, thank you very much.
Also, Valéria, I'd just like to thank you as well, and from me and Daniel, for bringing this show to Minneapolis and for doing so well. Thank you.